What up, you guys? Nate with Executive Fit here. I have a cool trick that we figured out in our private group called the Epoxy Inlay Workshop. It is a closed group on School where we do weekly Zoom calls to talk about epoxy inlays, work through problems and whatnot. And we actually figured out this past week how to calculate the volume that you need for an epoxy inlay at any depth. You can use this formula, this tool, to figure out how much epoxy you need at any shape and any depth. So previously, up to this point, it's been very difficult for me to teach people how to figure out how much epoxy you need to fill, this white shape right here, because all of the calculators that I found online were if it was a perfect square or a perfect circle. And then you'd have to guesstimate based on if it's not a perfect square or circle, how much you should subtract. However, we figured out in Vectric, there's a simple tool in Vectric you can use to calculate your square inches, and then we just convert that to cubic inches and then figure out from there, using a simple formula, how much epoxy you'll need to fill any shape. So without further ado, let's go ahead and get into it. It's going to be basically a screen recording of Vectric. I'm going to walk you through the process. It's very simple. Check it out. Okay, here we go. So what we have here in front of us is two logos that we're going to be doing epoxy inlays on. And just for reference, I want to show you guys what the size of these are here. These are only 12 inches by 12 inches, so we're not working with a terribly large overall size sign, but we can still use this tool to figure out exactly how much epoxy that we're going to need to use. So first off, we're going to be doing a black epoxy fill inside the vector line that I have selected right now. So this is the bird logo for Executive Fit, and we're going to be doing a pocket here about 0.15 inches deep, and then we're going to fill that back up with epoxy. So we're going to use this tool to figure out exactly how much epoxy that we need. So we're going to select on this measure tool, measure the distance, area, length, etc. Here. And typically I've used this tool in the past simply to measure the distance from one point to another point. Look, 12 inches, boom, done. However, if you select this span/contour properties tab here, you can then select the vector that you want to get some data on. And what this does is it has this little area highlighted right here. Up the top here, it shows the type of line this is. This is a Bezier curve. It shows the length is 0.96 inches, shows you where the start point and the end point is for this particular section of this vector. But if you look down here, this that I've selected has a more data here on the overall size of the vector, which is the actual bird logo. It's showing that the area is 37.78 inches squared, which is exactly what we need to figure out how much epoxy we're going to need for this. It also shows the perimeter, 40.177 inches, so that's 40 inches all the way around. This is useful if you're running LED lights around the border of a sign or doing a neon sign. You can use this tool simply to figure out exactly how many inches of light you would need. Anyhow, side note, we're going to take this data here, the area, 37.78 inches squared. Now, to figure out the volume of epoxy that we need to convert this number, 37.78 inches squared, to, instead of square inches, we need to convert it to cubic inches. So we're going to go over to this calculator that I found. It's a cubic inch calculator. And what we're going to do is we're going to plug in our area, which was 37.78, and then we're going to add in our height or our depth, how deep we're going to cut it. And I have it set to 0.15, so that's how deep we're going to cut. You could use this for any depth. If you're going to cut 1/4 inch deep, 1/2 inch deep, whatever you're going to use, you add in your height or your depth of cut here. When we hit calculate, it's going to give us our result in cubic inches, which is 5.667 cubic inches. That's perfect. We can use this number now, 5.667, to figure out how many ounces of epoxy we need. To do that, we're going to do a little bit of math. So this is an epoxy calculator on omnicalculator.com, and I want to show you this formula right here. Our epoxy volume equals volume divided by 231. Well, what is volume? Volume is that cubic inch number. 5.667 is the volume of epoxy that we need. So all we have to do is take the volume number, their cubic inch number, and divide it by 231, and that will give us how many gallons of epoxy we need. Now we'll then have to convert that to ounces, but especially because this logo is so small, we're not going to need anywhere near a gallon of epoxy to fill this with resin. So what we do, we take our cubic inches, 5.667, and we're going to divide that by 231 divided by 231 gives us 0.0245324675324675 gallons of epoxy. To convert this number to ounces, we multiply it by 128 because there's 128 ounces per gallon, and that gives us 3.14 ounces of epoxy. So we would need about just over 3 ounces of epoxy to fill this with epoxy resin. Now, I would typically do a little bit more than that. I always typically just mix a little bit extra just to be safe. However, that would at least give you a good starting point, and especially because you don't necessarily want the epoxy to be perfectly flush. You kind of want, let's see here, if I can draw this out to annotate it. So if this is a cross-cut view, right, of your V-carved area that you want to fill with epoxy, you don't, let's go to a new layer. If this red line is going to be my epoxy, I don't want to fill the epoxy perfectly flush, right? What I really want to do is I want to fill my epoxy to be slightly above, okay? That way when we sand this down, we can sand this flush with the surface of the material. So you can at least, what this does is this gives you a number to start with. We're going to make 3.25 ounces, or we might just round that up to 4 ounces, right? We'll mix 4 ounces of epoxy and we'll be good to go for one of these. So since I'm filling both of these, I'm going to be doing 2 of these for this particular job. I'll mix 8 ounces of epoxy and go from there. So that's basically the process. It's very simple. You use a cubic inch calculator to calculate your square inches and your depth to convert your square inch to cubic inches, and then you use this formula, volume divided by 231, gives you the amount of gallons you need, and then you just convert from gallons to ounces, and you're good to go.